Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for participating in this webinar. So this time round, my webinar is quite unique because we have a guest speaker, Dr. Mark Langhorst. So for those of you who have already exposed with the ArchiMate, you have been reading about attending the course and also implementing ArchiMate. The name of Dr. Mark, I think, is there because he's also one of the influencer as well as the founder for the ArchiMate notational language. So of course, Dr. Mark also is the managing consultant and chief technology evangelist with the BizZdesign, one of the world top leading enterprise architecture tool that ATD is partnering with. And of course, the topic is quite unique because many of the instances that I come across in typical enterprise, they say that we are using agile development in the agile environment. Therefore, we have no place for enterprise architecture. Is that true? And of course, now the agile itself has been evolved. Everyone wants to be agile, and of course, we cannot deny that basically architecture does not hinder or stop the progression or the establishment of the agile practice. In fact, it complements because when you do agile without architecture, basically you will be creating many modules, many small applications, and at the end of the day, 2 years, 3 years from now, you will be end up with the mini island. Then it's not 100, maybe 1,000 or millions. So of course, the maintenance will be a nightmare. Agile is fast to develop, but we also need to balance between what we can provide to the business, between the speed, the agility, and the maintenance. So basically, of course, if you want it to be very fast, then we have to compromise many things. But architecture put it into a balance so that we can provide a better value of the technology for the business, and we still can embrace our agile practice within our development environment. And of course, in this presenter letter, you can hear directly from Mark that how agile environment can be so-called a safeguard with the enterprise architecture. Not only in terms of producing a better and faster results or outcome, but also in terms of the easy maintenance. And we understand the impact when you do agile across a different environment or different teams within your organization. So with that, I think let me just give you an overview about who we are. I think for some of you who have never heard about ATD, so let me just introduce ourselves. Then after that, I will hand over to Dr. Mark to present about the interesting and also a practical approach how to adopt or establish enterprise architecture within the agile environment. So this is about ATD. So we are basically a company established in the 2006, and we are branched up into 4 or 5 countries, and we have a 4 line of business. In the early days, we do a lot of training. And of course, as I think some of you already our alumni, and I think we got 10 of thousand of alumni since 2006. And of course, we have also established our consulting sometimes 8 years ago. But I think our consulting now has grown tremendously because of our practices in the area of the digital enterprise architecture. So we also run events like now we do a lot this year since March, we do a lot of the webinar. In the past, we almost every week on the road show, on the industry trade show and also events. And we, of course, offer all the best of the source in terms of the developing competency in the enterprise architecture. ISA developing the body of knowledge. So they have a so-called specialization in the business architect, information architect, software architect, infrastructure architect, and solution architect. So for those of you who want to be equipped with the right skill set to perform the job as an architect, so ISA providing practical knowledge and also competency for you to become architects. And of course, we have the open group. So open group have TOGAF. TOGAF is the proven EA framework. Later, we also listen from Mark, Dr. Mark, in terms of the how TOGAF itself can be modified to support the agile environment. And of course, they got the ArchiMate, which is the notational language, which is very important. And of course, recently TOGAF also open group issued the TOGAF Business Architects, which is also gaining popularity because business architecture is something that we cannot ignore. It's the first thing first for every architect to do their work in terms of the starting their enterprise architecture development. So we also have governance in terms of the COVID foundation, implementer, and assessor, as well as the DevOps and also the ITIL, which is ITIL 4.0 in terms of the IT service management. So in terms of the training path, these are so-called our recommended path. If you want to develop a so-called competency to become the top layers as either as the business architect, information architect, infrastructure architect, software architect, or solution architect. So they got the training path. And of course, for those of you who live in Malaysia, government has given 100% grant. So actually, we have still a limited seat. Is basically if you are Malaysian, 100% free of charge for you to take this training and certification. And if you live in Singapore, I think the grant is 90%. But if you are from FSI, financial services sector in Singapore, you can get grant up to 95%. So you only need to pay 5%. So you can contact our office representative in the respective countries. And these are some of our achievement of our consulting client. So we also churn out the global winners in terms of the getting Open Group President Awards in 2018 and 2019. So we have the so-called the winner in 2018 from Malaysia government, as well as from the Ministry of Housing in Malaysia. And in 2019, we got the winner President Award from Statistic Indonesia. Yeah, so these are some sort of the achievement, the milestone about our capability in delivering the world-best architecture consultancy. And of course, this and we do also have a few clients that our output are reviewed by Gartner. So in terms of the stringent requirement of our consulting services has been reviewed and also called vetted by Gartner analyst itself. So they're basically fulfilling and meeting the industry standard. And this is very recent. This is just happening this month. So two of our clients, which is Pemodelan Nasional Berhad and Mampu, both are from the Malaysia government. One is the investment arm. The other one is central government. Also won the top 10 EA Awards 2020. So this is also say a lot about who we are, about what we do. So we churn out, this one is the top 10 EA Award 2020 for Forrester, awarded to the two of our clients. And these are some of the rest of the client that we are doing. And of course, we have many more on that. But yeah, our client portfolio are quite wide spectrum, from the country government to the FSI to the oil and gas, and as well as all the financial services industry. So in terms of the digital enterprise architecture, actually they got many target stakeholders. So many people think that enterprise architecture is only for IT team, but that is not right, because as you can see in this diagram, that the EA itself can target the head of strategy in terms of you are developing a strategy for your enterprise, like even the customer strategy. So you can use enterprise architecture to a platform like the BizZdesign for help us in terms of designing our strategy. Then for business architect, in terms of the defining our organization structure, our processes, our function, so we can so-called help the businesses to understand about the impact, to understand about the gaps that they are facing in terms of like how do we do a proper transformation. Then for the chief digital officer is basically to understand which are the area that we need to be digitalized more, right? So basically giving them a landscape. Then for the chief customer officer, in basically to create the map, like to use design thinking and how to enhance our customer relationship. So you can do that using so-called enterprise architecture concept, and of course with the BizZdesign platform. And as well as for enterprise architect, technology portfolio manager, project portfolio, and application portfolio, as well as solution architect. So all these are basically the platform for the architect to model the enterprise, to analyze, to understand the impact, as well as to come up with the roadmap implementation. Then for investment manager and the chief risk officer is basically to understand which are the area of investment that we need to go ahead this year or this term. Because we basically in the typical enterprise, they got a zero-sum games. Basically is that the budget is limited. So if we had invested in the one particular initiative, we cannot invest in another initiative. So with the enterprise architecture itself, we can so-called prioritize and categorize which investment is the most strategic. And of course, for the chief risk officer and the CIO to understand the whole landscape of the enterprise and identify any opportunity or any gaps that exist. So with that, let me just give you a typical context of the transformation. So typically, you will have so-called digital enterprise architecture team or office that you look at the so-called data architecture, business architecture, application architecture, and technology architecture. So all these have a respective context. Once you have that defined, then you also need to look at the security. Then you, of course, now talking about services. So you look at which are the digital services and integration architecture that are required to connect between business, application, technology, and data. Once you have done that, then you can also feedback and do alignment with the digital transformation and the strategy initiative across the enterprise. One is confirmed, then you can develop a solutioning. So solution architecture is where you are connecting what are the gaps that currently exist with the available technology at hand. So with that, then we can so-called churn out many project, many initiatives as one of our transformation project. And this slide, basically, this is my final slide before I hand over to Dr. Mark to present about the Agile and the enterprise architecture. So with the enterprise architecture itself, we can do so-called strategic planning in terms of the business, IT, as well as digital. And we also need to can understand and monitor our portfolio, our risk, our technology management, and as well as any change management, and whatever the solution that so-called we are churning out. So basically giving us a snapshot of the enterprise. And I believe some of you have already attended my earlier webinar. Otherwise, you can later on available in the YouTube, you can connect and review some of the webinar that I've explained in detail on how we're going about doing this. So with that, I think I will quickly hand over to Mark. And yes, yeah, Mark, I think we'll be presenting about half an hour or about there. And yeah, over to you, Mark.
Well, you introduced me. I'm Managing Consultant and Chief Technology Evangelist at BizZdesign. If you want to reach out to me, here you can find my contact details and a bit about my background. I'm in enterprise architecture, have been in that field for over 20 years now. And some of you might know my name from the ArchiMate language for enterprise architecture, because I've led the development of that and I'm still heavily involved in that within the Open Group. This presentation will not really be about ArchiMate. There will be one or two slides that address that, but it is on the combination of architecture and Agile. Just a bit of background on BizZdesign. If you don't know us, we are a software company that supports organization in designing and realizing business change through our software platform that consists of Enterprise Studio and the Horizon portal. All the examples in this presentation were made with our own software, of course. So that's the background of that. This is not an introduction to our tool, it's just some context for you. This is the slide that we are probably most proud of in this presentation. Gartner and Forrester rank us as a leader, and as you can see in the latest Gartner Magic Quadrant, we are not just a leader, but the leader of the leaders. So that's just promoting BizZdesign. Now let's go into the meat of the presentation. I want to start with a bit of background on our vision on change, because that informs the rest of the presentation. And as you can see in the subtitle, change is really speeding up for most organizations. And as someone remarked in a presentation I saw a few years back, change will never be as slow again as it is today. It's kind of frightening to think about that. This picture really shows that. This is a graph of the lifespan of companies in the Standard & Poor's 500 index. And as you can see, of course, there is a wavy pattern from the economy, but lifespan goes down and down and down. Companies live ever shorter life, and that's mainly because companies are basically superseded by competitors that are smarter at change, that can better respond to the changing times. So it's very important for organizations to be very good at change. And as Darwin has said, it's not the strongest of species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the most adaptable. And that's really what this is about, making sure that you are adaptable as an organization. And what we see in many organizations is that change is really painful, and that therefore change is done only occasionally. When it's really, really necessary, organizations wait too long often. And also change is something that has been directed from the top down in many organizations. And then you get to this picture on the left. You have this stepwise change, which is risky, which is painful, which is expensive, and that's, I think, not the way it should be. Rather, you would like to have a situation in which you can change continuously, where you can adapt to changing circumstances when these change and not after the fact. But that requires you to make change possible at a much lower level in the organization, from the ground up, from the shop floor. You want to enable people to contribute to change in the entire enterprise. That is the background of our vision on change, also informing our own products. The idea is that you can provide people with the right information and tools to make change possible at their own level in the organization, rather than having everything managed from the top when it's nearly too late or maybe even already too late. Now, this is, of course, something that is very much aligned with the whole notion of agility in software development. Agile as a term, you could say, has been hijacked by the development world, but I want to look at it from a broader perspective. Agility or adaptivity, or what you want to call it, is not just about software development. It's really about making sure that an organization moves with the times in a broad sense. And this pace of change that it increases so fast, much of that is driven by technology. Moore's law driving the speed of technology change, and that's, well, basically exponential change. What you also see is that this leads to a pressure on organizations that are traditionally maybe not as fast in changing, say government agencies, because customers from companies are used to seeing lots of innovation and project that expectation also onto, say, traditional, slower organizations, and they are disappointed if you can't move at that pace. What you also see, and that's of course especially in the private sector, is that the speed of change really determines who wins, and especially in internet-oriented business models, the network effects of the internet make that many businesses have this winner-takes-all effect. Amazon taking the whole retail market, Netflix maybe taking most of the online video market, etc. So that is a very important effect, and that means that you really have to be fast to capture a large enough part of the market to survive. On the other hand, a very different effect is that we see in many sectors, say in finance, for example, or in healthcare, that the regulatory pressure grows and grows and grows. More regulations have to be implemented, and that comes on top of all the other change you have to do. So this is another reason to become good at change. Make sure that you can implement these regulations. But there's also an upside. If you are good at this, you can use your agility to outmaneuver your competitors. If you are the fastest, you can really reap the benefits of that. So it can really become a strategic choice to invest in agility, not just to keep up, but to be a front runner. Now, of course, there are many challenges in becoming more agile, and here are just some cultural challenges that you can see. And it's sort of a parody, but if you look at how people look at change, users of software, they like routine. They don't like their user interface to change every day. So change is a nuisance to them. They just want to have their regular way of working. It shouldn't change too much. But developers, they like change. Change is fun. It's a challenge, new intellectual challenges. They're curious, so they like that. In quality assurance, change is something you need to test. You have to make sure that it is good enough. System administrators, they really see change as a risk. They don't like it at all, because any change to something that works well, you know what they say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Managers, they look at change from a perspective of time and cost. Change has a deadline and budget, which is often at odds with the notion of agile development, where they say, well, we can't promise upfront what we'll deliver at the end, but we'll do our best to make it the most valuable possible. And then finally, architects, of course, probably a large group of the audience today, they look at change from the perspective of coherence. The bits that are connected to each other. You can't just change something locally without considering everything it's connected to. So those are just some specific perspectives from different communities on change, and that is a challenge in making organizations more agile and adaptive. Now, to put the agile versus architecture worlds next to each other, this is of course a caricature, but what you see is that agility is really about being responsive to change, and architecture looks at clear plans. So yeah, you might be agile, but if you don't have a direction, like the Cheshire Cat said in Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. Architecture thinks about the future and where you want to go, but it might be too rigid. 5-year plans don't work anymore. Agile is really about fast decision making, but have you really considered all possible risks and problems? Architecture is more deliberate, but it can be too slow. Agile looks at the world from, let's say, with an open mind. There's no fixed future. You just take it step by step. But yeah, well, where are you going then? You might want to define at least some direction, but a future state too far into the future won't become reality anyway, because the world will change while you're developing that future. Agile, if you look at the Agile Manifesto, is really about people first. It really talks about people and interactions over tools and documentation. But what you forget is that Agile really is about discipline then. It's not just about having nice interactions with people. It requires more discipline from developers, for example, than a more rigid process where you're kept within the guardrails by the process. Architecture is maybe the opposite, really focused on the process, but maybe too bureaucratic in that way, not focused enough on interaction with stakeholders, with users, with customers. Agile looks really at it from the perspective of teams. Agile teams are the core of agile development in software development. But if you only look at it from a team level, each team might build its own agile silo, and that's certainly not what an architect would like, because that is, for the longer term, very difficult to maintain. And I have seen situations where agile teams just really build instant legacy because it's not maintainable. Architects really look at coherence, how the bits fit together, try to come up with standards, how do we connect applications to each other, etc. But you can't standardize everything, and it might slow you down too much. So there really is a balance to strike here. Now another aspect of this, another angle to look at this, is that there are at least 3 specific aspects of agility you need to consider. Process agility, that's the agility that you know from agile development, an agile way of working. Scrum, Scaled Agile Framework, that's really about process agility, the process of development. But you also have to look at the agility of what you're building. And we call that system agility. And if you have a very agile process, but if you're pouring concrete, the end result is still not going to be agile. So system agility is equally as important as process agility. And the system agility is something that architects are usually more concerned with, whereas the process agility is more for the development teams. Together, this gives you business agility, where you can use your agility as a strategic focus, use it to outmaneuver your competitors, based on these 2 parts of agility, process and system agility. So one important message of this presentation is that Agile is not just doing Scrum. It's not just having an Agile process, and certainly not just having an Agile process for your Agile teams. You need to do more than that. So I'll have a few slides on process agility, but most of my story will be about system agility. But just to get into process agility, I think the key contribution of Agile thinking is that it is about collaboration. In a waterfall process, you just throw stuff over the wall to the next in line. But in Agile, it's really about working together as a team. And that also is important for architects, because in a waterfall process, there's an architect in there somewhere architecting stuff. And then there are all kinds of other roles involved, but you don't have this close interaction. The architect might not ever speak to a user, maybe to a business analyst, perhaps downstream, maybe not even to developers. But in an Agile team, you really all work together. And architects have a role in that, and not just let's say software architects or solution architects, but even enterprise architects. To convey the vision, they have to interact with these teams. Now, of course, this is again 2 extremes. In practice, it's usually not that extreme that in a waterfall you have these brick walls between stages, but you get the idea. Now, a typical Agile process takes your prioritized user stories, plans these in iterations. You get your iteration backlog for your sprints. Then you have an iteration, then your daily work, daily stand-ups. Some workable product increment comes out of that, that's reviewed. And then finally, you do a retrospective on your way of working. This is the classical process that Scrum and other methods will use. Now, I think that retrospective might be one of the key aspects of the success of Agile. because it helps you fine-tune your way of working. It's not just about incrementally building things that users need, but it is also learning how to do that. So that double loop learning might be one crucial factor in Agile, in agility. And this is also important for architecture. Learning how to improve your architecture practices. You can learn a lot from how Agile goes about its business. And if you look at the previous picture, an architecture process might not be a 2 or 4 week iteration. Developing architectures might take more time, but the same structure could apply there. So thinking about these iterations, thinking about priorities, thinking also about this retrospective where you look at your way of working, that's certainly very important for architects. Now here we see a picture of a larger scale way of working in Agile, the Scaled Agile Framework. In my experience, the most popular way of doing Agile at scale nowadays. There are some other methods, and what I'm telling is basically that will apply to the others as well. Now this picture looks a bit complicated. This is the full Scaled Agile Framework, 4 layers deep for really big organizations, and lots of it is mentioned there. If you go to their website, everything is clickable, very nice, but also a bit confusing. I'll have a picture that's a bit simpler to stress some of the essential parts of this. But the idea of the Scaled Agile Framework and of similar approaches is that you have the teams at the bottom that do the actual work, but you have to have some coordination on top of that to make sure that their results work together, that it's aligned with the business goals, that you have the priorities set in the right way, etc. Now, onto system agility. That's really about creating flexible results. And the big factor in that, in my experience, is complexity. Complexity is really the main enemy of system agility. If everything is connected to everything else, you can't change anything anymore because the whole rest of your system has to move along. So complex systems are really not agile. Understanding the complexity, that's what you need first. Well, that's already difficult. The changes themselves are a lot of work because you have to take care of all these connections. You might forget something, so you might have all kinds of ugly side effects, so you have to redo some work. And of course, you need to do a lot of testing. You have to test all across your entire landscape. And there are some numbers behind this. An analysis from MIT, paper in MIT Sloan Management Review, calculated this, that if you just add 25% functionality, the complexity of systems will double. So that is, well, that's quite terrible. Certainly, if we look at the start of the presentation where I talked about the speed of innovation and the speed of IT, especially where you see that we have this exponential growth of IT and IT functionality, well, you can imagine what that does to your complexity. So keeping complexity in check is key to agility. And that is where we need architecture. Also, because if you look at the way of working in Agile, you have the product owner as a typical role responsible for prioritizing the different user stories, different features that need to be built. But product owners are often focused mostly on functional requirements. They have maybe a business background, they understand the business and can decide on what the business needs. But all the non-functionals, who takes care of those? Things like compliance or the relationship with other areas of your landscape, with strategic direction, priorities, etc. So that's something that individual product owners don't always see. Enterprise architecture as a discipline can really help there, because it helps you translate your business strategy to these wider ranging decisions that go beyond the scope of individual teams and product owners. So it helps you make sure that everything is aligned along the same goals. It doesn't mean that you have a detailed design for every solution, but it does mean that you give some guardrails to these individual teams, solutions, etc., to make sure that they move in the same direction. So it prevents you from building individual silos that have their own goals. It helps you ensure coherence. And of course, it helps you keep this complexity in check, because if you just have individual agile teams building local things, like say microservices, just having lots of microservices and allowing anyone to connect to anything, you get a huge web of dependencies, and you can imagine the complexity that arises from that. Now, one possible solution to that, one pattern that might help you, is what Roger Sessions called the Snowman architecture. And this is from his Simple Architectures for Complex Enterprises. And you can already see why it's called a Snowman architecture. You see a snowman here. His idea is that you have to have autonomous business capabilities that own basically their own applications and data, and connect through well-defined services. Because you have these defined at the level of business capabilities, they have a business relevance, and if they can move on their own while still being connected via these services, you get a lot more flexibility than when, for example, the whole application landscape has to be shared or all your data has to be shared. That might be more cost efficient because then you have this world of shared data only stored in one big database, but it lacks flexibility. The different parts of the business can't move on their own. So there's a trade-off here between efficiency and flexibility, and this architecture pattern focuses on this flexibility, this autonomy, whereas sharing your applications across different business units, sharing your data, it might be more efficient, but it might not be that flexible. Now, another aspect of architecture, and this is taken from the Scaled Agile Framework again, it talks about the architectural runway as a way of making sure that the bits of your architecture fit together. The bits of what the different teams are developing should fit together, because occasionally you work on architecture and not just on features for the end user. And that makes sure that all these different parts will work together and land on the runway, and you build out the runway just before things should arrive at your metaphorical airport. If you don't do this, you get in a situation where adding features becomes more and more difficult because the complexity grows and grows and grows. So that is certainly not what you want. You need to be aware of that. You need to make sure that you invest in the quality of the architecture, of the structure of your solution. No matter whether it's software or processes or whatever you develop, you have to keep that quality in check to avoid the picture on the right, where after a while it becomes more and more difficult to change anything. This picture from Philip Kruchten really nicely illustrates these different areas. On the left you see the things that are visible, and things with a positive value that are visible are features. Things with a negative value that are visible are the bugs. Then we have the invisible part, and that's often forgotten in your investments, and that's what you need to spend time on. And in the at the positive side, that is where architecture lives. You don't see it as an end user, but it adds value. And on the negative side, that is technical debt. That is stuff you need to clean up someday. That is complexity you want to get rid of. This picture is nice to explain to people, also to non-IT people, why you should also invest in stuff that's not directly visible to the end user. Now, another thing you can do as an architect is make sure that you separate different parts that to reduce dependencies. One important one is separating the know from the flow. That is the knowledge on things like decision making from the logistical flow of information. And what I've seen in the past in many organizations, especially administrative organizations, that their business processes become way too complex because they add all kinds of exceptions. I've seen things, for example, in social security institutions, in government agencies, where they have this big process that specifies how some specific request for some social benefit is handled. And there you see that they have encoded all the exceptions in the process. That's terrible. That's really too complex. If you separate the knowledge on the decisions from the flow across the landscape, that's much easier to maintain. Well, here we have an example from the insurance world where, for example, every step in the process in handling an insurance claim always has the same steps: register, accept, adjudicate, and pay. But the rules are different for different products. Different types of insurers, of course, have different rules for adjudicating claims, for example. But the steps in the process are similar, so that's separated. It's easier to manage. That also leads to the next picture, where you can discuss how to standardize. And here we see good standardization. Let's call it lengthwise standardization, where for different insurance products, auto, health, and life insurance, we have standardized the steps in the process. So if we would add a new type of insurance, new product, say home insurance, we might look at the existing steps, combine parts from one and another product, and quickly set up a new process for handling home insurance claims based on these steps. Now this works, but the next one, this is what you should not do: crosswise standardization. Because what you get over here is that you have one big registration step, one big acceptance step, one big adjudication step. Well, take the adjudication. If you would have one big process and set of rules for adjudicating any kind of insurance claim, well, you can guess what complexity you get from that. You don't want that. So standardization as such can be good for agility, but can also be bad for agility. And you have to think about that. It's not just one or the other. So standards have to be considered really, really closely. And that also holds for things like technical standards. So this is on the process level, but in your software, you have the same discussion. Another way of improving agility as an architect is using smart business infrastructure, because hand coding everything is just very costly. And we see lots of this type of infrastructure. For a long time, you've already seen things like business process management and workflow systems, business rule engines, these low-code development platforms, smart web forms, and even before that, data models for databases you could easily configure graphically rather than putting in complicated SQL statements. So this kind of flexibility offered by these platforms is also very useful. Now, some people in the agile world say, yeah, but that then gives me a platform that itself is not flexible. But you don't need flexibility in anything. It's like, well, the example at the start of the slide, I don't really need very flexible electric wiring in my house, but I do want to plug in all kinds of devices. So flexibility in places is good, but trying to keep everything flexible is just very, very costly and leads to compromises. Whereas if you have some flexible, configurable platform, one of these examples, that really helps you speed up change. You can also use models to improve agility, and that has to do with, for example, these business rule and business process platforms. The classical way is you have requirements, you build code, program stuff, and there's some outcome. But if you have executable models like process models or the business rule models, it's often a lot faster, and you can much quicker test your requirements, try it out, implement it, rather than doing it the long way around via programming all the code. You can't avoid it always, but there are many areas where low code or no code or model-based platforms really help you speed up change. So then we have to look at the combination of these, the system and process agility, agile architecture and agile practices, and there we get to the role of architecture and agile development and the integration of these. And the classical way of doing architecture, where you have this waterfall process, like say TOGAF promotes, that's not the way to go. You have to have continuous, just-in-time, just-enough architecture in lockstep with your agile development, but being ahead of that so that they have the information available when they start to create software. So you have to guide their work by having enterprise and domain architectures as the guardrails of the more detailed development down below. In the agile teams, they own the architecture. You might want to have an architecture owner role in there that specifically focuses on that next to your product owner to make sure that you also pay enough attention to the non-functionals, to the structures, to the architecture, to the technical debt, etc. So they can have an important role in that as well. Then if you look at TOGAF, I already mentioned that. This is the classical way of doing enterprise architecture, but we need to restructure that. All these activities in there are still relevant, but the process that is suggested by the TOGAF architecture development method, the ADM, that you see in here, that's not really the way to go, because this assumes that you do architecture first, and then you have step G, where you see the implementation governance, and that's then where the implementation happens. So this is still somewhat like a waterfall. What we need is to put these activities side by side in parallel, also in parallel with the development, and then you get something that's a lot more agile. So continuously, iteratively developing your architecture from your vision behind it, keeping track of the baseline so you're always up to date with that, evolving your target architectures while the world around you changes, and then guiding and governing change together with the actual development process. This is a much better way of structuring that. So TOGAF itself, the activities in there are still relevant, but the TOGAF process really needs an overhaul to work with Agile. Now, I mentioned the Scaled Agile Framework before, and this is my simplified picture of that. So we start with some strategy that comes into the portfolio level, then you have large solutions, programs, and eventually the team level. I'm not going to talk you through all of these aspects, but you see these different aggregation levels where things come together. You have an iteration within each of these levels, but it also iterates across. Of course, the outcome at the end goes back into the upper level to really substantiate these business outcomes and feed back into the development. Now, if we want to map this to what architects do in these layers, at the highest level, the portfolio and solution level, that's really where architecture tools and techniques can really help you in making decisions. Portfolio management, architecture models to show the linkage from strategy to realization so that you really have traceability. The program level is really where you want to have your roadmaps and release trains and architectural runways and your dependencies. That's really where you can manage that. And at the team level, this is really where architecture, enterprise architecture connects to development tools. Maybe developers have some UML models or other tools, say Jira for tracking issues. Integrating that with your architecture world also gives you traceability, and you can, for example, analyze the effects of what would happen if an agile team decides to push a feature to the next sprint. What would be the higher level impact on the overall architecture and on the enterprise goals? Now, I mentioned that I wouldn't say much about ArchiMate, but I have to say something about it, of course. Mapping the three-level SAFe framework to ArchiMate, it starts with stakeholders and their strategic themes. That's then decomposed into epics, features, and eventually stories at the lowest level. These are put on the different backlogs at these different levels. You can use ArchiMate plateaus to model the staging of this from product increments via releases to the overall roadmap. But what's also quite relevant is that if you use ArchiMate concepts, you'll see that at the higher levels of SAFe, you will use more abstract concepts. So on the right-hand side, you see that at the top level, you have the concept of course of action. What's our high-level strategy? Then you have the capabilities you need for that. Then you have maybe application services or business services that you need to develop. Then you have the internal functionality to support these services. And finally, of course, you have the components that actually realize that. That's what the teams are building. So in using ArchiMate in an agile context, you can use the higher level concepts, the more abstract concepts at the higher levels of SAFe, and the more detailed concepts down below where you map out the overall architecture. And of course, this isn't about solution architecture or software architecture. It's not about the details of the solution. This is the general context that an agile team has to do its work. That they could use ArchiMate internally for some purposes, but this is really their context. Now, what you could also do, and I'm not recommending that you should, but you can even model the work that needs to be done and the roles involved in that in ArchiMate. Could be helpful in some cases, but maybe this is taking it a bit too far. And now a small example of how we integrated these two worlds ourselves in our own software. This is about Archisurance, our insurance company that we use a lot as an example. And here on the right, we see some goals and epics that Archisurance has stated. So they want to improve their customer service and reduce labor costs. And then we see a number of outcomes that should support that. And we are going to focus on the middle one, customer interaction via virtual agents. That's an outcome they want to have. Now they are thinking about that in terms of what requirements do we need for that. And then the next question is, how are we going to implement these user stories in coherence with our agile release train and our overall architecture? So your architecture will help you define what to do when, because you can see the dependencies of the different parts in there. So an architecture model might help you with that. And we've integrated this ourselves because we also use Jira ourselves, with Jira as the most common agile tool. Pull information from that, and then you can plot this information about these outcomes. And here we see highlighted this customer interaction via virtual agents. Also on a Kanban to show what the progress of that is. So this comes from Jira, it's pulled into our platform, and we use that then to see what the dependencies are. So what would happen if something is delayed? What parts of my architecture can't function at that time? And you see here lots of these attributes that we pull in, just as an example. So that's one way of interacting between these two worlds. And here I've mapped some of these relationships with our solutions to several other levels. So what I was just discussing is really the bottom level where we import data from Agile team tools, but you can also map to other kinds of models. At the middle level, you could use roadmaps, higher level architecture runways, and features. You want to model those maybe in ArchiMate. Use your overall Kanban board that I showed you before on the previous slide. And at the portfolio level, there it's really about decision making on investments. Which strategic themes do we need to invest in? What are the expected costs of those? What are the expected benefits? What do we need to do in the long run? Where do we need to, say, consider regulatory compliance? Where do we really need to invest for security? What can be done today? What should be done tomorrow? The higher level discussions. So then coming to some conclusions. As I stated before, you have to change with the times, and change happens ever faster, so you have to become more adaptive as an enterprise. Whether you're in the private or the public sector, adaptivity, agility is key. And it is not just about agile processes, it's not just about software development, it's really an enterprise-wide issue. You have to think about your system agility as well, and without architecture, that is just not going to happen. Architecture is really indispensable for that. Models can be very helpful in various ways to support this agility, from making stuff more easy to implement, executing models, to doing analyses on priorities, on impact of changes, on what would happen if I would postpone this feature, what is related to this high-level strategic goal, etc. I also mentioned that one of the critical success factors of Agile is its own learning process. Is retrospective as a type of meeting, for example. So implementing new methods itself should be tackled as an agile learning process. So improving your way of working, do that in an agile way as well. And finally, I would say architects are really good at seeing how the bits fit together. So collaboration and coherence between people, between systems, I would say that is the key responsibility of architects in an agile environment. Now, that is the overall conclusion of my presentation. I want to leave you with one link to a little booklet that Peter Matthijssen, our CTO, and I have written on the adaptive enterprise, providing a bit more vision behind this whole story about the capabilities you need for this, etc. And that then concludes my presentation.